So thanks very much for joining us, Gillian and Petra. And I can see Chloe's online there as well. Just wanted to say hi, my name's Tim. I'll be facilitating this workshop today. Can you just give me a wave if you can hear me? Yep, great. Thanks, Gillian. Perfect. So thanks for making yourselves available for this afternoon's workshop around just a basic introduction to coaching. My role here is I'm a unit coordinator for our capstone unit for the business degree, and we have quite a strong emphasis on coaching in that unit. So we kind of recognised that we needed to perhaps be providing a little bit more engagement around what we meant by coaching and some of the expectations around coaching in a work integrated learning framework. And in talking with our other unit coordinators, that very quickly became this idea that it's portable to all of our work integrated learning relationships that we have. So I guess the core intent over the next hour and a bit is to really try and give some strong background as to why coaching is important, why we put it in terms of that frame of important conversations, and then step you through a fairly simple to pick up model. It's called the EFIRE model, which is actually the coaching model that we use at the Graduate School of Business in our executive leadership program to help you frame conversations with work integrated learning students or partners to help sort of improve the nature of those relationships specific to creating strong learning environments. Because I think sometimes we get students who feel that they fall into a work integrated learning role or into some sort of supervision relationship in work integrated learning, and they feel like they're being directed with tasks. And so they come out of that with skills and on the job skills, but not necessarily with the knowledge then or the nous as to when they're supposed to engage with those activities. And so like the active part of their brain hasn't necessarily been engaged as much as it could have been. And so the EFIRE model really focuses around that, like it's helping individuals self-navigate the issues that they're facing. Students quite often find it a little bit frustrating because almost every question that they ask is answered with another question. So sometimes that needs a little bit of framing up front. But we're hoping that if we can create a consolidated model of coaching that we're using across our work integrated learning programs, we can have that conversation with students as well to say, here's the model, so that they can have that expectation that, all right, you're feeling frustrated because no one's just telling you what the answer is, but that's the point. So hopefully we can get through that. If anyone has any questions today, if you're zooming in, just make sure you unmute yourself and feel free to interject at any stage. I've also got the Zoom group chat up on one of the screens here. So if you have a question that you think could wait for a little bit later, feel free to throw something into the Zoom group chat page, and we can circle back to those questions as we move through. And the same with anyone at the table. We've got microphones in front, so those who are logging in can definitely listen into that. We're also recording this session as well. So if you think there's any of your colleagues that would be worthwhile listening to this sort of stuff, feel free to pass it on to them. Because this coaching model is good not just for work integrated learning, but for pretty much any workplace learning or workplace coaching role. Before we get too far into it, I teach risk management, so I have to walk the talk. Simple workplace health and safety. I'm sure you all know where the lifts are, being level 11. You've come up through them. The toilets just sit behind that, and before you get to the toilets is the emergency exit. So if we hear the alarm, that's where we're headed, and we basically head straight out that way from the building when we get down to level 2, and there'll be a mustering area there if someone decides to trip a fire alarm today. But I'm hoping that's not going to be the case. So in terms of some workflow, most of this is going to be a jam-packed background of theory and just good knowledge bombs from good business authors around good conversations and sort of placing it in that managerial business literature sort of setting, mostly because the conversations are portable from will into the workplace. Then we'll move through the will model and give you either a chance to practice it if we've got time, and if not, just open Q&A time as well. Before we get underway, do you guys have any questions for me? No? Cool. Anyone on Zoom have any questions there? No worries. Thank you. Okay, so I put this quote up on screen just to really try and set the tone for the content that we're covering today, as well as really for the intent of coaching in general. I just love that this focus on the energy and vitality of individuals and organizations alike depends on the quality of the connections amongst people in the organizations. And so if we're having better conversations, that's really the intent of a good coaching model, is to improve the effectiveness of those conversations. I think one of the things that we're provided with an opportunity in work integrated learning conversations, or managerial conversations as well, is that we're really trying to set context for others. The world that they're living in the workplace is largely the context that we provide them. And sometimes the brain's full of positive and negative signals and self-talk. And so sometimes it's easy for individuals to get lost in that story. So having some sort of coaching framework, I guess, provides us with a framework to help people or to help others guide themselves or to be led through that positive and negative self-talk. And actually the EFI model that we'll talk about today is rooted in positive psychology. So that's some nice expectations. I also like to frame this idea of conversations, that the conversations we have in the workplace or with with students or anyone, we're all primed to have different worldviews. But a simple way of thinking that in terms of like functional roles or work integrated learning roles or employee roles is that whether you're a manager or an employee, you're probably somewhere between one of these two extremes, being more of a mechanical mind or an adaptive mind. Someone who, if we think back to McGregor's classic theory X and theory Y, the theory X approach being very much mechanical, it's all about systems and processes, alignment to the policies that we have, versus the adaptive approach, which is more that maybe the policies are just a broad general framework that gives us some indication of direction. And as long as we're all doing the right things here, we can work together to achieve goals together. So I like to have that sort of as a base piece of theory up there as a way of thinking that most of the conversation we'll have with people will sit somewhere between those two. Very rarely will you sit at any one of those extremes. But we do underpin this idea that individuals inside of organizations, and our students in particular, we're trying to give them a better sense of agency. Well, I think that's one of the things that we almost train out of our students going through university degrees is we tell them what the box is and how to fit the box, and all the assessment structures that we have are all about fitting a particular box. And so they just want to be told, well, how do I fit better in the box to get a better grade? But realistically, when you get into the real world, here's a problem, go solve the problem. Well, what's the box that you want me to fit into? Just tell me the best result here, and that's what we need to go for. And all of a sudden their mind is blown. So if we don't have that sense of agency, if we don't allow students to, or our employees to shift more into that adaptive frame of mind, we do run the risk of then having to essentially overmanage those relationships. And so that's why I think having a framework, a conversation framework that doesn't give the answers all the time can be very pragmatic. The pinch of salt to that, sometimes you just need a result today. So you might need to just give them, this is what I need from you today, but in that broader sense, trying to get people to helping employees and students find a way to self-navigate through those pathways is important. And to do that, we're going to focus today on really trying to conceptualize our discussions around a solutions-based approach rather than a problems-based approach. Part of that's the positive psychology that sits behind it, but it's also about how it sets up the narrative for the questions that come out in coaching conversations as well. So if we think about, we've got these two different mindsets, and we're going to have some sort of conversation into that space. I like to start thinking, well, in terms of how we communicate, coaching conversations don't always happen face to face. We would love if they always did, but because it's the richest form of communication media that we've got, but we don't always have that luxury. We might be time poor, we might have to zoom in, or we might just have time for a phone call, or maybe it's even something that's going to be via email. And just that reminder that is a context that you're operating in, and that has implications for sense making and those sorts of things for others. One of the things that we quite often struggle with from a coaching perspective is our own intrapersonal narrative in terms of our ability to sense make what we're hearing from someone who needs to be coached or to have those real conversations. And sometimes it's more about our ability to sense make. Our brains are already primed to come up with solutions. The human brain is all about shortcuts and solutions. So we're going to be primed to have an opinion about where this conversation should go. And so sometimes the hardest part from an intrapersonal effectiveness perspective is to acknowledge that and just put a pause on wanting to lead it down a particular path, to say, well, in my experience, I know that these are all the right things, but from the other person's perspective, what does that mean? What are the struggles that they're facing, because they might have been different to the experience that gave you that sense that that's the right way to go. And for them, that may give them actually the wrong triggers. So putting a pause on that's quite important. The interpersonal side of things, again, that comes down to we can quite often have strong triggers with text and type. I know I can be very blunt on emails. And so while I try and keep emoticons out of email traffic, every now and again I'll read through something, I just don't know how to restructure that. I'm going to have to put a smiley face on there so they know I'm not being mean about it. It's just having that emotional intelligence, just to understand that sometimes I know that my EI is not as brilliant as it could be on a written perspective. So how do I try and mediate that moving forward? Because especially when you're trying to have a real conversation and ask someone about their feelings or their perspectives on something, if they perceive that they're being judged early, then they're already going to give you only part of the picture, because they'll be trying to keep themselves safe. Something else that we're seeing quite a lot in work integrated learning is more of a focus on group projects or team projects rather than just individual one-on-one, like placement model work integrated learning. And so again, that has an impact on the nature of coaching. Most of the coaching models are set up for one-on-one interaction with others. So being able to identify some of the team dynamics is important. And if you kind of pick up on that, sometimes it's easiest just to think about Sun Tzu, divide and conquer, and manage the coaching conversations discreetly rather than as one combined team. Other times, if the energy feels good and everyone seems to be open and expressing, then quite often keeping it in that group setting is quite good. One of the others that we quite often face here, being a university and most workplaces in Brisbane, is this idea of multicultural work settings, diversity, and so having some sort of awareness of what intercultural communication actually means is something that's important as well. We're looking at maybe having a follow-on to this particular workshop around intercultural competence. So there's something there about perhaps touching on this in module 2. That's more of a note to self that we might want to build that forward. But just in terms of, again, like appropriate levels of eye contact and that intrapersonal effectiveness. Like quite often I'm talking with a student and seeing them saying they're not engaged, they're not engaging with me up here, but from a cultural perspective, the most respectful thing for them to do is not to look me in the eye. So just having that awareness that could be going on. And this idea of mediated communication, that maybe we're having to work through something that's not a rich picture of a person sitting or standing in front of them for a conversation. If it's via phone, again, you've got to really overemphasize the language to cut through, especially if someone's feeling a little bit pressured or a little bit anxious at the time, their ability to pick up on social cues starts to diminish, or they go the other way and they become hypersensitive to things that, especially from a negative self-talk, it can basically make their own messaging a little bit worse. So when we think about trying to place all this into a conversations framework, I love this text from Grattan and Goschel. In terms of conversations like the harder managerial work, managers talk. It's through talk that they teach, inspire, motivate, and provide feedback, plan, and take decisions. I like to kind of flip this quote on its head and say, well, for coaching is not managing. Managing is trying to essentially herd a bunch of cats in quite a lot of situations. When it comes to coaching, we want the cats to figure out how they need to move themselves through whatever we're trying to move them through. So in that case, I'd say that yes, as coaches, we talk, but we also very strongly listen as one of the primary goals. Through that interaction, we don't inspire, we allow others to be inspired. We help them to find places or ways of motivating themselves or connecting them with processes or people that can help to motivate them. So as a coach, it's very rare that a coach becomes the source of inspiration. They just become the sounding board that allows people to find that inspiration, to find that motivation to take themselves through. One of the things I like to say, this is an important thing to take note of in a coaching relationship, is that if you take on this more managerial role and you kind of try and step people through it a little bit more like take their hand and walk them through the process, what we quite often find is that students or very much new hires will then treat that as that's how things are supposed to work here. And every coaching conversation that you try to have will have that expectation that you'll lead them through and sort of handhold through that process. So being strong on saying that, don't be the source of inspiration, be the sounding board so that they can find it. I like that as sort of just this, does this interaction feel right at the moment, or are they sort of loading all of that responsibility on me as a coach? If you find that responsibility is being loaded on, you might need to rethink and change up that dynamic. In terms of where Grattan and Ghoshal sort of go with that paper that quote is taken from, they propose this map of conversation. So, as every consultant loves a good 2x2 diagram, we have one here in terms of thinking about what's the nature of the interaction that's going on, and the nature of the content of that conversation. So how invested are you, and how much are you actually sharing two ways? So when we start to think about even if you just get rid of the categories or the descriptors on the X and Y axis, those four different types of dialogue become quite, I'm sure we've all been in a conversation or a meeting that's just felt like dehydrated talk. You get 3 or 4 minutes in and you're like, why are we having this conversation? If you're stuck talking about the weather for more than 10 or 15 seconds, you're in dehydrated talk. This idea that we could be in a more intimate exchange, that it's not necessarily high task related content that we're talking about. We're just talking about who we are, but you're doing that in an invested way. You're actually sharing a little bit more about yourself. You're engaged and you're interested. Right, we're in this element of intimate exchange, which is really great for trust building. And you think about when everyone started sitting at the table, there was no conversation going on about coaching. It was just, let's catch up, let's talk and have a real talk about where you're up to at the moment, what's been important in your life. That's at that intimate exchange level. Disciplined debate is where we're going to get to today. In terms of we're going to be quite heavy on content, but we don't need to deep dive past that. Well, okay, we're just going to keep it to the box. Here's the box that we want to work in for today. But when you start to say, well, let's throw out the boundaries of this conversation, we'll deep dive and we'll talk about content and we'll just see where the conversation goes. Then we're in this area of creative dialogue. And that's the area that, like when you talk about sense making, when you talk about problem solving, that's largely out of that creative dialogue. But it takes quite a bit of time to get there. I'd like to ask the question quite simply, where do you think coaching sits inside of this broad map? Like which quadrant or quadrants do you think coaching belongs to?
I think it started a bit of intimate exchange just to get to know each other. That's what I would have thought.
So starting with intimate exchange, yeah?
Yeah. Coaching, I think it's a bit between the two top ones as well, discipline, debate, and creative dialogue. Both of them, I reckon.
Yeah.
Across everything.
Across, yeah. Bit of everything.
Build a rapport before you can ask a question, before you can dive deeper, and then it's a bit of trust building.
Yeah. So you're looking at end-to-end conversation. It sort of probably starts somewhere in dehydrated talk, the classic opener of, man, it's been hot today. Move your way towards intimate exchange as you start to learn a little bit more about each other. Whether you go from intimate exchange up to creative dialogue or across to disciplined debate, I think most of the time we'll find we go to disciplined debate. What's that, sorry?
I was thinking of, depending on what personality I'm dealing with.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of people just do not want to do an intimate exchange, so it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
It could be very much.
And very much from an intercultural perspective, like if I'm talking to one of my Dutch students or one of my Dutch colleagues, if I ask them what they did on the weekend, they'll tell me, but then the follow-up question is, but why do you want to know? So that's something that's always worth acknowledging as well. I think you'll probably find that 90% of discussions, because coaching quite often is not a long wandering debate. I think most of us are a bit time poor, so we try and compress our coaching conversations into, let's talk about what we need to cover today. How can we help, or how can we navigate this sort of situation? We quite often find that it moves very quickly from intimate exchange. Let me bring you up to date. Here's what's on my plate today. I might be facing these 10 different things. Okay, let's take one of those and try and improve outcomes there from a coaching perspective. And we very quickly move up into something like discipline debate to try and figure out where the boundaries of the conversation could be, where those limitations exist, and then to try and problem solve. You do need to end up in creative dialogue for some amount of time there as well. Not so much for, as Grattan and Ghoshal discussed, the inspiration, but more for the sense-making perspective, getting them to identify, well, where do their limitations of understanding sit? By having some sort of disciplined debate around and interaction about, well, here's how I see the problem from the coachee's perspective, you get to understand some of perhaps the blinkers that they have, some of the cognitive barriers that they may have to approaching a particular situation or task. And sometimes just asking them the question, well, I can see you've defined it this way, but why did you define it that way? Like, is there some sort of experience there, or is that what you've been told? Like, and just unpacking that a little bit deeper to allow you to better identify where those limitations sit. But we'll work a little bit closer towards it. So I think in a coaching conversation, you'll find we go through all 4 of those phases, and it will depend on how much time you've got. Is this the first time you're engaging that coaching conversation with someone, because you might want to spend a lot more time in intimate exchange, just getting to know one another, developing that trust base, so that maybe 2 or 3 coaching interactions in, you can almost just go, you just completely skip dehydrated talk, right? We know this is a functional relationship here for coaching. So let's talk about what's on your plate today, where are the struggles, and we can start taking the conversation forward from there. Because one of the things that I like to be pragmatic about, and particularly from a work integrated learning perspective, or if you're doing coaching as a managing approach, is to be really pragmatic with time, because coaching conversations can start as a 15-minute conversation and turn into a 2-hour diatribe. So to try and keep that contained so you can keep a focus on productivity and effectiveness is always important. It would be wonderful to have unlimited resources, but unfortunately that's not how it works all the time. I might just give that a moment of pause just to say, are there any questions that we've got so far, or comments that anyone's got? Anything online from our Zoom crew? Great. All right. Well, if we have anything that pops up on the feed a little bit later, we can always circle back. So, as a little bit of a thought exercise for yourself, because we are going to do a little bit of conversation as we work through. It's not going to be just all me talking. I want you to have a think about when, where, and with who you have the most important or the most valuable conversations you actually have at work, because we can use that as a sounding board to start thinking about what are the conversations, the useful conversations that you have, and compare and contrast that to a coaching setting. Ingrid? So have a think for yourself just for 30 seconds. And if you're online, feel free to share something up into the group chat. But after that 30 seconds, I'll just get you to have a little share amongst yourselves as to give an example of one of those good conversations that you've had.
Work or where you don't have the distractions of other things happening.
Actually, yeah. For me, I'd probably say the same. When you manage to get away from the mainstream in your office, because the distractions are a big problem.
Yeah.
I did that this morning before I came here. A colleague and I were at our street office. We're normally based in with the technology teams, but this time we decided to take ourselves away from any of the areas of the business we commonly work in, just to map some stuff out on a whiteboard, and it was really good because we were away from it all.
Yeah. I think that's the thing, because the previous box is all about to get to that top right you need time.
Yes.
And all the other stuff is the top
Yeah.
left is very much time constraints. You pretty much
Very, yeah.
it becomes more direct and more what you need.
Need to do this today, need to get that done, need to unblock this as opposed to diving into the deeper. So where are you?
I'm actually QT.
Yep.
So I'm assisting with Ingrid, but I'm probably recommending the Q Super.
Okay, yes. Yes, I'm obviously the RSQ side.
So she's going to take care of that.
Cool.
Because I actually studied recently, and I did this unit.
Oh, nice. Nice.
And I did it with Q Super, so.
Yeah, okay, so you're actually in there as a
Ingrid said, oh yeah, stick with that.
Yeah.
Stick with that one because you know
the people over there.
Yeah, and the industry and that sort of thing.
Oh, nice. Very cool. Enjoyed the unit?
I did. Even though I've got a lot of work experience. I still find I learned a lot.
So were you doing a master's in business?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've been interested in that actually recently.
Okay.
I have been studying something completely unrelated.
Yeah?
Maybe thinking of shifting to something maybe a little bit more related to my line of work. So
What are you in RCQ? What's your role? Or what area?
I'm head of solution architecture, so I look after all the technology designs for
Oh, wow.
the projects and the here and now. So that's my world.
So very much IT
Very,
focus.
yes. So we don't currently, so we've got enterprise architecture, which looks at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
My team very much focuses on the IT projects, the IT designs.
Yeah.
That being said, I've got my direct reports. We sort of have a motto about where we can add value, and if that value doesn't include technology, that's fine.
Yeah.
We need to add value to solving any business problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my world.
And be busy with what's happening in RCQ.
Beyond crazy, to be perfectly
A lot
honest.
happening there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I play tennis with someone who's RCQ on the IT side. Andy.
Any questions?
He's got a back issue at the moment.
Any questions?
Is that Andy Costin? I don't know his surname because I play tennis with
He's
I only know him on a social basis.
tallish guy, short hair.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Carrying a little bit of weight, not
not a huge amount. Is it an architect? Do you know?
I don't I know he's on the IT side.
The only
He used to be at Sunwell. I know that. And he contracts.
Yeah, well, I just brought, so there's a gentleman who works for me, Andy Cossins,
Yeah.
who back's just recently gone out. He had an operation a couple of years ago on it, and it's gone again now. So I reckon that's the same guy. Yeah. He works for me, so he's a good guy, Andy, actually.
Yeah.
He's an absolute star for me at the moment. So.
Yeah, I know him. As I say, from tennis. So he used to work with a friend of mine that works for some. So,
Cool.
but yeah, I haven't seen him lately at tennis because he's back.
Yeah. Plus, we're working him to death, to be perfectly honest. Hopefully, not too much longer. Oh, he's permy now, so yeah, I managed to turn him permanent, which is great for me. So, but yeah, I've got to get him to project. We're going to kill him if we're not careful. So, he's doing that. I cannot talk about how good of a job he's doing. It's amazing, but it's not fair on him. So, yeah. No.
Yeah, because I know he was working on the bank side.
Yes. Yeah. So he was.
Previous role.
Yeah. So he was contracting with the bank side, and that also went down. But I had some stuff coming back up in the insurance space, so I put him a role as an insurance domain architect, and he came on board. Yeah, awesome for me. So, and if you talk about, you know, useful conversations at work, he's one of the best at them.
Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, he knows
I'd imagine so.
the right level and the right place and how to have the conversations right across the board, from general manager and insurance right through to the developers of everything. So
Yeah.
he's very good at that.
Yeah, because I imagine so you probably have quite a few people in space that maybe.
Now, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, and I'm usually a big fan of a noisy classroom, because a noisy classroom is a learning classroom. But I just want to say thank you for sharing some stories, and it was interesting that after sharing some initial insights, we went straight into our lower right quadrant there about some intimate exchange and starting to learn a little bit more about each other, which is wonderful. What I'd like to ask, like we've had a couple of comments that have come up on the chat feed discussing, you know, where and when might be some of the good approaches, and that, you know, quite often in some sort of informal setting is the way to go. So, you know, when and where do these conversations take place? Coffee was mentioned up there a couple of times. For yourselves, where do you find usually the best places for these sorts of coaching conversations to take place?
We were talking somewhere disconnected from your everyday work.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's very easy to get distracted back into the everyday work side of things, and to go to sort of the task-based conversation as opposed to the actual flow of coaching.
Yeah, and sometimes when you're in the workplace, can you truly be open about talking about things that you've got problems that you need help solving? You know, sometimes there's that added layer of oversight that just stops you, or even if you have a good trusting relationship with the person you're talking to, there's always that fear that someone might just be overhearing the conversation, or have seen you walk into someone's office and like, are you just going for another coaching conversation? Like, you know, having that awareness can be quite important. Any other insights out of that?
I think Kelly had a good point. Nothing to do with venue, as long as the content's right. So for me, it was very much similar to your point. Where you have what conversation for me makes a big difference, but for you that wasn't a big deal as long as the content was right.
That's just me personally though. I think that's difference of personality, and I don't really care if somebody overhears me. So, you know.
And it's also to do with corporate culture. You know, like there's some cultures where it's a little bit, you know, dog eat dog sort of world. And so that kind of information becomes like, has a particular social aura around it. Others are a little bit more about, if you have any sort of problems, they should be aired first and early and loud. And so, you know, that has a very different dynamic to say, well, can you have genuinely any conversation in any workplace? There are genuinely places that have different ways of working. In terms of the skills, the insights, you know, something you can take away from thinking about the ways of approaching coaching, like what's important to you in terms of, like, do you have an ethos or an expectation around how you should approach coaching, or is it just sort of an open world and have a chat?
It probably depends on if there is a specific goal being looked for out of the coaching session, to be honest. If it's just a general catch up around, you know, my life in general and how I'm progressing in my goals, that's probably a different conversation to, I'm having this problem and I don't know where to go next.
Yeah, and I'd usually say those sorts of conversations are more collegial conversations rather than coaching conversations. I think coaching conversations always should have a particular goal, so that you know how to direct your attention and how to support someone. Admittedly, sometimes people don't know, and they might just sit there and say, I'm feeling a bit lost. Well, okay, now you've got your direction. You're trying to help provide them with some direction. But if it's just a general catch-up, then that's just being collegiate. And I think it's sometimes worthwhile knowing when to activate a coaching model and when not to. That's a good part of it as well.
I think for me, sort of just hit the nail on the head, it's active listening for me is really important, because sometimes people don't know how to clearly articulate where they're going wrong, or they don't fully understand what that root cause that's causing their issue is. So the more you actively listen, I think that's where you pick up your triggers and your understanding on how you can best guide.
Absolutely. So that point of always reframing what you're hearing and speaking it back to them, and watching for their cues as well. Because quite often that active listening isn't just what you're saying back to them, it's the body language that goes with it.
Yeah. Girl 5 whys every now and then.
Yeah. I think one of the most powerful triggers for turning off a coaching conversation is the body language. Just like if you're having an in-person conversation, you have to be really careful about your body language. Like sometimes someone's trying to open up to you and they start telling you about something that's a really big problem for them at the workplace. And you might be trying to empathize with them and, you bunch up your face a little bit and you take a sharp in, you take a breath, trying to empathize with them that, yeah, that's a really harsh situation. But from their perspective, they might sit there and go, judgment. So understanding that you're trying to stay calm with body language in coaching conversations. And again, that comes down to understanding what's the conversation we're having today. Is this a coaching conversation? If so, you've almost got to have a bit of a mode. You've got to be very disciplined to sort of pull yourself back to be actively listening, yes, but not sort of be too overemphasizing the body language and those non-verbal cues. Because it's just so easy to, just when someone was about to open up and really explore their own problems for themselves and to articulate that, and they sit there and go, oh, well, I guess we don't have to talk about that today. it's conversation. I like that one. So Gillian, a key principle from you is to have a key takeaway. I think that's so an end goal for a particular conversation. Is that right? Yeah, having a good purpose for the meeting. So sometimes I think we might, it's very rare, I think, to have a coaching conversation that is purely ad hoc. So this idea that we might just find ourselves in the middle of, oh, here's a coaching opportunity, let's go for it. I think some of the most effective coaching conversations is when it's pre-planned. You've contacted your coach, the person that your go-to person, to say, look, I'm just having some trouble today around X, Y, and Z, or even it's I'm hitting a roadblock, I don't know what that is. Can you help me figure that out? Okay, we now have a purpose for it. So you know what the nature of that conversation is going to be, and that allows you to better schedule your time as well. Classic, is it going to be a 15-minute chat, 30 minutes, or am I going to need to push something to make time for it?
Tim, in that work integrated learning context and the projects that these guys are working on, whether it's RACQ, Deloitte, QSuper, Brisbane City Council, that's part of the preparation of the teams to come with, this is what we'd like to get out of our meeting, our catch up this week, but also the coaches probably over the next couple of weeks to get a feel for, these are some things that I think the team might need, even if they don't realise. Yeah. So the team's being prepared to say, this is the outcome, or this is what we're struggling with, this is what we're finding difficult, yeah. Being able to respond back to that.
That's a great point. I think one of the things that we have in the units is just how much time we have. Like if we've got a coach for a particular team in the capstone unit, for example, we only have an expectation of 15 to 30 minutes per week of interaction for that coach for that team. So coming with that agenda, having that purpose, really becomes a very important part of that pre-conversation planning. So, but also from a coaching perspective, or the coach's perspective, to not overcommit as well, which is quite easy to do early on in a coaching relationship, which then sets a precedent. And everyone's like, well, last time you talked to us for an hour and this time you're only giving me 15 minutes, what gives? So to stick to those guns and to say, look, we've got time, this much time allocated, let's make the best use of it. You're coming to me with 5 different things you want to talk about. Let's prioritize those and we'll see how many we get through, and just flipping that conversation back so that it can be that effective use of time. So in terms of a quick couple of questions that have come up, will we have multiple coachees? It depends on the nature of the unit that you're in. So some of our work integrated learning units, you're engaging with teams, and so you would be engaging at the team level. In saying that, the team might send one representative to say, we collectively have a problem, can you help us to solve that? So it really comes down to the nature of interaction with that team and the individual coach in that perspective. Some of the other units, it's more of a one-on-one relationship, especially if that's a placement model.
Yeah, all these guys at the moment are team-based, so the team-based model. So the team-based model, perfect. So hopefully that answers your question there, Petra. But yeah, certainly if you've got any others, yeah, please keep them coming through. So in thinking about in a team setting, actually moving forward into they're going to be more like a structured meeting rather than just a catch-up chat. I love to relate back to this piece of literature is really talking about one of the key skills is to manage the meeting. And so much of the time, and I know this is an old reference, but in teaching through the public sector management program, where we're talking to managers all the time, they always seem to resonate with this point.
how often have we been trained to manage a meeting? Beyond setting a time, a date, a place, and an agenda. Like we can be doing things better. And the same happens with coaching discussions, that idea of just flipping that conversation and to say, well, okay, we can set an agenda, but now the agenda is too big. How do we actually prioritize within that? To having clear expectations around the types of language that we're allowed to use in those conversations. You would hope in work integrated learning contexts, in business contexts, we would hope that it remains professional. But sometimes when it comes out of a team setting and back to a one-on-one setting, sometimes it's a bit easy for colloquial language and a few S and F-bombs to be dropped every now and again. But thinking about how we actually, like what we think of as being a good meeting is sometimes the best template for thinking about how we might manage our own meetings. So I'd like you to think for a moment. Yes, Patrick Lencioni's Death by a Meeting is a brilliant book. Lencioni's got we do quite a lot of teaching around Lencioni in our PSMP as well. I just want you to have a think around these points. Your experience brings a lot to the table in terms of letting you know what you gravitate towards in managing a meeting. So think for yourself about what a good meeting looks like, feels like, what's the processes that sit behind it. Sure. So have a think for yourself, what does a good meeting look like? And by contrast, what does a bad meeting look like? You might have had a whole bunch of meetings that just bleh, somewhere in between, but what are the really bad ones if you don't have a good one to go to? Or have you heard stories of great meetings? And just think for yourself for a moment what that might look like. And then I'll get you to share a couple of insights.
I've heard stories of great meetings.
just asking for a friend. So in that perspective, I just want you to have a think about what makes a great meeting or what kills a meeting. Have a think and then share with the person next to you. We've got the mics on so that hopefully those who are logging in can listen into some of these, and hopefully you too can maybe write down a couple of examples for us as well. Love to hear some examples, and we'll use that as a template for moving forward.
Okay. All right.
To be honest, a lot of in between meetings, I think.
Yeah.
We've got a meeting that is structured.
In the sense, what
And it's
exactly is
something
the
that
other
the
one?
next one,
yeah.
Just a very basic level. Too many structures. I think so to me it's like
And it was because
and if it's up for discussion,
you get onto one topic and then
everyone comfortable in that issue.
digress.
Yeah, instead of coming back to the point
It's
of
been
the
Angela,
meeting.
and whoever's chairing it never
Yes, you did.
cut it off and said, yeah, it's really good, let's go away and come back and well, this next week. And it's really coming out of it. So no, I can coming out of it. So
Yeah.
it's been all the time.
Yeah, that's what I actually
Yes.
So it's EQ, it's
And I think that's probably the biggest emotion for me as well.
Yeah.
That's, I could be doing someone else leading. It's far more valuable. That being said, I've also had meetings where someone needs to put up front what we're trying to achieve. And we go through that.
Where
Always like it,
There's been
recapping that.
notified outcome or the outcome.
And one of the things
Or
we're
it's
quite
unnecessary
in
content.
our meetings
Yeah.
are where
That's like I need meetings where
we all come in with great intentions.
Yeah.
And then like you just said, we talk around about stuff and then we all come in
and you end up
and you don't necessarily go back.
I
and
know,
go
because
through
it's
the action
been out
process.
to the way,
That's probably, I've had a few meetings
let's just do this.
where it's almost like that's
So
exactly
those
how it's
sorts of
structured, this is what we're
yeah,
gonna achieve. We're gonna discuss it and then we recap at the end. And every action point is assigned to someone. That's a really good
Yeah.
meeting.
And it's really templates from the Lucy, which is
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
the other part,
Yeah.
one of the that example.
Yeah.
It is.
Content.
To ensure that you're choosing it. Yeah. Otherwise, yeah.
What happens is,
Yeah.
The 10
I know that, I think a lot of meetings are called these days
Yeah.
with benefits. how else am I trying to get these people together to talk well? So
It's worse when you're asking a question. How can you do that?
But I know, I mean, I've been guilty of calling a meeting.
You report it in the end, say yes.
yes, I probably done the exact same
And
thing.
that's,
Yeah, so to me that
Which
is
is
the
done
a bit more work
worse.
and set it up a bit
Because you
more.
ask me my intellectual part,
It's now,
to do something.
Yeah.
it does.
Yeah, ticking boxes.
I always like to
That is-
think about people.
That's
saying
more
that-
organizational.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So many
Here
things
and
that
come out with
they're
no
overnight are
So- I do. I think that happens a lot everywhere.
Well, that was a.
Oh, right, yeah, that's true. Yeah, please review.
That we've been charged for last time you think.
Yes.
It's weird, yeah, much better than-
Not necessary.
After the meeting, I'll go to
Nah,
the training.
That being said, I think
Short and
it's
sharp.
very good.
Or you
Yeah.
There's definitely bad ones, but there's also some very good ones. And funnily enough, the difference is who it is. It comes down to the people.
Oh, yeah, when I got to my meeting, that long time, and then.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's so easy
You know,
to
actually
just.
having.
Yes, it's
You
not
already
people that aren't
Delegate.
well together, probably is the word. It's a bit like if you've got a cross-functional team that are all high performers, just managing, sort of organise themselves, they just,
Yeah,
you don't need
yeah,
a leader.
absolutely.
So it makes it easier as well, because they're from different areas, they know what they're responsible
Yes.
Bring it
for.
back on track.
So they know what they
Ah,
need to
right.
look after.
Yeah.
So having
When you get a bunch of
You're
people,
always
that maybe
sharing.
there's a bit of grey area,
And
that's
unnecessary
when you need a good
Yeah,
facilitator or
I think
chairperson.
that's, yeah, for me, I think so.
as long as
Because
that
they
doesn't
stop
happen.
the ongoing conversations,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Oh, and
turn
the
around,
purpose,
so-
I think,
Yeah.
and so probably if there's not.
Can't be
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. You need
That's right, yeah.
As long
a
as not those
chairperson,
two.
because they need to keep
Should be
bringing
okay.
it back.
Should be.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Okay, we've hit the double crescendo of noise. That usually means everyone's had just about everything that they wanted to say. This has been a good conversation starter for our Zoom group chat, and I think we've all had a terrible meeting. We've all had those meetings that we sat there and said, why did I get an invite to this? The last thing you want to do is say, well, I'm never going to get that half hour/hour back. So, no, I think we've all got some horror stories from or things that could be improved with meetings. There's some nice comments there in the chat feed about things like what happens if groupthink is really a key theme inside of a meeting. That can really be a slippery slope to an ineffective meeting. There was definitely a like for agendas, but there was also some debate there to say, well, should we have a really strict agenda and we just charge through the action items and we're done? Or should we always have some room for flexibility inside of our agendas as well? And so what sorts of, if you're going to have a really highly structured agenda, that you can include your agenda item for other business. So I think that's always a worthwhile addition there, and to actually create a culture within your team or within your meeting environment that it's okay to add things in. Usually that comes through good time management within the meeting. So if you have that agenda item for other orders of business, then you need to actually be finishing early. Because if everyone's sitting there watching the clock going, I've got 5 minutes to the next meeting, and someone says, oh, about that really big, tricky situation, and everyone just kind of, there's a bit of eye rolling and you're going, I'm going to be late for this next meeting until that's resolved. Or people just revolt and they stand up and they walk out and go, I just got another meeting to go to. So, you know, absolutely.
I was just actually thinking one of the things that I don't ever see happen in a meeting at work is planning for time at the end to be able to get to your next meeting. Most of us are back to back these days.
Wouldn't that be lovely?
It's a bit like what they do at the universities where they try and finish the classes 15 minutes early.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that? That's amazing.
It works some of the time. Some of the time
Yeah.
that works. I think what was interesting is Sheryl Sandberg CEO of, I think it was Silicon Valley. I want to say AOL, but it's not AOL. Anyway, large tech company in the States. Her approach around business meetings and structuring in time was that, yes, we have time for getting places and or social media. And social media for her included emails and those sorts of things. So that when you walk into a room, the phone goes down and not on the table, because putting the phone on the table is just signaling to everyone else, look how important you are. I'm going to put my phone down. I'm just going to paraphrase Simon Sinek on this one, because he makes a couple of really good pointers here. And he said, and it's not more polite to have the phone face down than face up. It's just, it's out there and it's telling everybody I'm on someone else's clock, and so you're sharing my attention with whatever could potentially come up on the phone. So you put the phone away, we have a nice intensive conversation for, say, rather than making it a half-hour meeting with everyone a little bit, there's an email, no, I'll deal with that later. Lucky us. If you're deciding to be in the room with us, have that 20-minute engaged conversation and then shift on to having 10 minutes of that half-hour time slot for specifically picking up the phone, going through those emails and actually creating time and space for that work activity. And that was quite an interesting approach. Like, most people can wait 20 minutes for a response. For most people, some businesses you are always on the clock and you might need to have a different culture, but most businesses are okay with someone replying to you in 20 minutes rather than right then and there. And so creating that kind of culture is good. Here's an interesting comment. How would you feel about meetings that start with all execs having 30 seconds and then the agenda is created from critical items brought up in the content? That's a nice innovative idea there, Petra. I do like that approach. And it would depend on the level of conversation and the level of meeting that you're having inside of a business. In terms of how that works with, say, a coaching relationship and coaching teams, that actually might be a really proactive approach to sit there and say, we know that we've got this laundry list of things that we'd like to talk with you over, say, the next 15 to 30 minutes. But can we just tell you a little bit about the nature of them and you help us prioritize? That might be one way, like, to just contextualize that neat insight for a good business setting back into a work integrated learning setting. So I think having some adaptability there could actually be quite interesting. In terms of where this sort of all takes us in our thinking, largely when we have a bad meeting, it's because we're not given an opportunity to actively listen appropriately, because active listening actually requires us to be able to provide feedback. So that I provided a comment up there saying that sometimes there's some sort of managerial diatribe, like they just go off on this big monologue and everyone kind of sits back going, all right, we know what the next 20 minutes is about. It's about, position setting, or there's something going on here. If you're not provided with the opportunity to stop, to listen and to provide feedback, you need to interject. And from a coaching perspective and a work integrated learning coaching perspective, that's absolutely critical. If students are just going off on this huge rambling monologue, you need to interject and stop and say, well, what's actually the issue that we need to talk about here? Or you're talking about 5 really critical things here. What's one that we can really just narrow in on today and solve that for you? And that helps you to, I guess, refine that agenda and to steer that conversation in a good direction. And again, asking a question to lead towards a productive outcome, which I think is always an important one. So I think when it comes to listening, we have good and bad behaviors in listening. There's a great local author, Alan Pease, who does quite a lot of consulting around body language. And when it comes to listening, he talks about this a lot in terms of what you're doing with your hands and your face at the time of listening and what that signals to other people. For example, hand on cheek just usually signals some sort of, I'm just checking out a little bit here. I'm getting, so my head's getting heavy. At the same time, to have your hands completely inactive, like under the table, people think, like, it's just less feedback that you're providing someone. One of the best things you can do in terms of an active conversation, pen in hand, taking notes, especially when it's a really short, sharp conversation. Like if you've only got 15 or 20 minutes to have an active discussion and perhaps follow up with someone, they want to see that you're actually engaged and listening to what it is that they have to say. Even the simple act of holding that pen in front of a piece of paper makes them feel like you're active and engaged. Because I know that if I try and write things down, I'm now disengaged from the conversation, but I like to show them that I'm here. So it's just, sometimes it's symbolic action there as well. In terms of the challenges to listening well, I usually think that one of the hardest is the setting that you've been placed in. Like if you go to a coffee shop, it can be like, think about the old school communication model. Someone's sending a message, someone's receiving a message, making sense and putting some feedback. Between all of that sits this thing called noise that gets in the way. And it's either cognitive noise and our ability to sense make, or it's literally noise. Like it's all the things that are distracting us. If we've got lots of background information going on, lots of people walking past, you know, it is legitimately hard to listen to sense make, because your brain's actively firing on all of these things that aren't the problem that the person's there to discuss with you. So I think sometimes it's important to say, yes, a coffee shop is a great neutral place, but find a quiet one is a nice one, to have. We're just moving on because I realise I've probably added a few too many slides into this slide deck for an hour and a half. But when we think about actually trying to engage with someone, there's a few points in literature and good practice that I've sort of put up here in a few dot points, just to try and say it's important at the start of a conversation to really outline, here's my level of engagement with you. In a coaching conversation, and especially if you're a little bit time poor, if you've only got 15 to 20 minutes, moving through dehydrated talk, or even making dehydrated talk not on the communication list today, and trying to move through that intimate exchange reasonably quickly is important. So sometimes setting up some ground rules for the conversation is important, because it allows you to listen effectively, and in listening you can actually then use those ground rules effectively. So say indicate that you have time for the person is also telling them how much time you have for them. Unlimited time is not going to work in anyone's favor here. It detracts from getting to the point, and it ruins everyone's schedules for the rest of the day anyway. But it also helps you to drive through about, well, what do we really need to talk about here today? Identifying a purpose for listening is just simply setting the agenda and acknowledging it for yourself as the coach, and then communicating that back to the coachee to say, I'm hearing all of these things that you're saying. Is this the one thing that you really want to focus on, or is there something different? Like creating that space to say, I'm listening to you, but let's actually find that one thing that we really need to solve today. In a 15-minute, 30-minute conversation, having one thing you can solve is good. 2, outstanding. 3, might be setting our expectations a little bit too high. And one of the hardest things, permitting silence, especially if you've only got 15 to 20 minutes to have a chat with someone, having someone sit there and sort of withdraw themselves from the conversation as they're trying to figure out what the next thing they want to say is. Not all of us can extrovert well, so we need that time to process and internalize. And as soon as we get past about an 8-second pause, things start to get quite uncomfortable. And we just start to feel a bit agitated, and we want to fill the void. But 8 seconds is a long time. Like that's 8 seconds. But it doesn't start to get uncomfortable until about 8 seconds, but it's enough time to sit there and say, you know what, we can exist here absolutely fine before you start getting the jitters. And one of the things that we're a bit predisposed to doing when we get the jitters and thinking it's getting a little bit quiet here is to pull out the phone, because you want to stay busy, because our brains are now programmed for productivity. But actually then pulling out the phone just tells them, I've decided not to listen anymore. So again, it's about having that disciplined approach to the conversation and actually permitting that silence and not interrupting the silence either. If they can't figure it out for themselves, let them get to the point to ask you for that help. You know what I've been thinking about, I just can't quite figure that out. And that's when you can offer the help. Well, should that be what we focus on today? And that figuring out what the big problem is today is simply our action point. We can move forward from there. Because all of that is progress for people who are struggling to make sense of what they're looking for. And the thing that I struggle with a lot, especially in my own household, don't interrupt or finish other people's sentences. The interrupting part, I always wait for my turn to speak, but quite often you've gotten the first 4 words out of your sentence. I know what the next thing to say is, and you're taking a while. Let me just finish that off. So sometimes I sometimes break some of the rules as well, but I try. So when it comes to listening is one side of things. Questioning and creating good questions is essential to any sort of coaching, regardless of which coaching model you have. I love this line to say, the ability to ask questions goes hand in hand with the ability to learn. This just sort of really puts it down to say, are we asking ourselves the right questions? And if your coachee isn't asking themselves the right questions, then it's your role to help them figure that out. Either you're asking them the right questions or you're asking them the questions that get them to that point. And we're not trying to lead or steer people to what we think is our desired outcome. We're just trying to steer them through a learning process for them to actually be reflective to figure out what the next stage is. So in terms of the power of questions, people live in the worlds that our questions create, which is right up there with the when you start talking about qualitative thinking and subjectivist culture, which thankfully happens to be my paradigm for research. But it really is about the world that we live in. When people start talking to you about their feelings and they're talking about a technical problem, you might sit there and say, but the problem's pretty clear, like it's over here with the technical side, but their feelings are actually that's the world that they're living in, and those feelings are completely matter. They're completely salient. And sometimes you'll hear people try and park their feelings aside from the technical. I know I feel this way and I just have to get over it, but, all right, that but is so essential when it comes to coaching conversations, and to not let them park it. That thing that they're trying to park is the thing that's stopping them from progressing. So that's what you need to focus on. And if you don't address those, I guess, those salient factors that they're trying to park, like that's their lens. Like when you start thinking about what's the reality that they're not really facing here, what's getting in the way of them progressing with their thinking here, they need to face those hard questions for self. They're uncomfortable because it's learning, and genuine learning actually is very uncomfortable for the brain. Like we talk about system 1 and system 2 thinking. System 1 thinking, our instinctive reflex that we've developed through experience. System 2 thinking, where our brains sit there and go, oh, hold on a minute, let me think twice about that. System 2 thinking, by very definition, and all the studies show, is like it creates anxiety in the body. So people don't like it because of that anxious response, but it's actually what we have to lead people through in a coaching framework if they're going to learn. So don't be afraid if they start looking a little bit, I'm not sure if we create the space for them to go there. You sit there and say, I know this is going to feel a bit uncomfortable, but this is a really key question, because here's the promise. If we figure out what's going on here, maybe it's going to help unlock the next step for us, or the next level of performance, or just that thing that you can't figure out today. Maybe that's the stepping stone. It creates that space, that permission for them to feel uncomfortable, and to acknowledge that feeling uncomfortable right now is actually okay. Because usually people sit there and say, I'm supposed to be invulnerable, I'm supposed to be perfect, so feeling anxious is not the desired outcome, something must be wrong. But actually it's terribly right in coaching conversations to feel a bit anxious. So that brings us to this point about what is coaching. Realistically, if we try and drill it down to from a positive psychology perspective, and really trying to think about what we're trying to achieve out of good coaching conversations, we're trying to create this sense of agency that we can better self-navigate if we are the one who is being coached. So coaching is raising awareness and responsibility, both for the coach and the coachee. So much of the time when we think about mentoring is that bootstrapping. We have the experience, we can tell you what the next steps will look like. That's handing your knowledge on, but not allowing them to build it themselves. So making it clear that their responsibility is actually to go through that learning process. Coaching is unlocking a person's potential to maximize their performance, because through that learning and growth, they become more confident, understanding where their limitations and their strengths lie. And I'm a bit of a subscriber to Drucker's old-fashioned approach to management that is all about strengths-based development. You can't really lean into your strengths unless you're familiar with what they are and what the limitations of those strengths look like as well. Coaching is a collaborative, solution-focused, results-oriented, and systematic process. And here's what I like about it. It's a systematic process. We can think about going through different phases of conversation to work to an outcome, and that's the model that we'll discuss today. We'll provide that scaffolding and some great example questions of the things that you can ask in those different phases to continue the conversation through. I like the idea of a collaborative, solutions-focused. Collaboration doesn't happen without trust. So you have to go through that intimate exchange phase. You have to invest in there. Otherwise, it's going to be this suggestive framework. It will be cooperative, maybe a little bit coordinative, but unlikely to be a fully collaborative approach. And collaboration, you both have skin in the game, which means that the successes of your coachee, you can be proud of your coachee's success if it's been a collaborative effort. And that's the psychological buyback of going through a coaching process. Okay, so the next slide, 8 key coaching skills. I don't want you to share this necessarily with the person next to you, but just to ask yourself, on a scale of 1 to awesome, how do you think you fit against each of these different skills? Like from a coaching perspective, we say you should be like a great coach is strong in developing trust, being present in the moment, so more of a mindfulness, being present, having good active listening skills, both the body language, verbalization, intonation, being able to clarify things if they don't necessarily understand, so that goes hand in hand with active listening. Are you good at empathizing? Some people are perhaps a little bit too good at empathizing, and maybe that can get in the way of being awesome at it. Being succinct. I'm an academic, I struggle, I admit. Asking the best questions and giving feedback. So as you read through that list, you'll start to gravitate to where your individual strengths might lie and where the areas that you might need a little bit of development. So just maybe have a think about writing down the things that you think of as being your key strengths. You don't have to write them down, but at least taking note of for yourself what you think your key strengths are and what your key limitations are. Just so that you can create a bit of an agenda for yourself, a bit more self-awareness, that as you go into a coaching conversation, what are the things that you might need to self-manage a little bit stronger? What are the things that you don't have to think about because you already acknowledge that it's a strength, so lean into it and don't worry about it. I should say, if you flick me an email today, I can send you a copy of a PDF version of the slides. So if that'll help, just if you're rapidly trying to write down everything that's on the screen, that'll help. And for those in the chat feed, I'm just going to put my email address up here now. Great. Just for anyone who's interested, that might just help. And especially for those who are in the classroom, I've got a handout to give you that's got an example of the coaching model that we're going through today, as well as some of the questions that frame them. For those who are online, just send me the email. I'll send you the file that has that question set in there as well. Okay, so we quite often see coaching not only as being this function within teams or for supporting teams, but it can also be seen as a strong approach to leadership, and certainly it works really well with servant-style leadership, this idea that we're here to support and to encourage others, but at the same time, we're not there to take on everybody else's responsibilities. And coaching really is great at keeping that arm's length from other people's responsibilities. It's still your responsibility. I will help you navigate that space. And I think that's sometimes a really good tagline to have in opening conversations in a coaching setting. And we've also got different types of coaching. The way this is set out on this triangle is basically to say, if you're looking at skills-based coaching, it's going to be fairly rapid. You can be very targeted. You've got something very concrete that you need to focus on. This is like kids turning up for the under-16s AFL training, and they turn up and they see their kicking coach because here's a skill that they need to develop. Great, we can work for 15 to 20 minutes and absolutely nail that. For performance, we start thinking more about processes, capabilities, strengths. Now that takes a little bit longer because we need to understand more about the individual, their strengths and limitations, what it is that they're facing, the nature of their work, so that by extension it takes longer to understand and to advocate into that space. And for development, development where we start talking about someone's career growth, all of those sorts of things like that, we're taking on a long-term journey with that person. So just understanding the nature of the coaching relationship you're going into, and that sets some expectations around how much time you invest into it, and what that means just for, is it for the next couple of months? Is it for the next year? Or is this actually something that we're just going to keep in touch with in the long term as we see this development pathway move through? In the coaching setting of work integrated learning, pretty simple. If it's semester based, we are right down here at the skills, like we're looking to help people develop specific behaviors, processes, ways of working. And so we can be very targeted. And because of that, the question set that we provide when we ask, what is it that we want to talk about today, we can be very targeted and very discerning. And if we get this broad, very wishy-washy response, we can actually be more critical and say, no, let's work on this a little bit more. Let's get this sharper so we can be effective in the time that's available. And that brings me to the eFire model. So for those in the room, I'm going to give you a printout of this slide and the next one, which basically has the model in a nutshell. The Venn diagram here is really just trying to explain that eFire revolves around the first E, this E of energy. And that's where the positive psychology comes into it. So the idea is that no matter what stage of this model you're at, whether it's in framing, inquiring, reflecting, or experimenting and getting it done, you try and follow the energy inside of the conversation. Like if you're having a conversation and someone starts to become a little bit more introverted, or they start perhaps even getting sad around a particular topic, feel free to shift on to the next one or backtrack. And the idea is that you follow where the energy is in the conversation. For example, if they're feeling a bit lost and they don't know how to frame the conversation, like what are we going to talk about today? I'm like, I really don't know. And it feels like you're starting to bog down in that conversation. I'd usually recommend moving to something like, well, what was the last thing you executed? Drive a little bit of energy into that conversation so that it pumps them up a little bit. You know what? Here's a bit of an ego boost. What did you just nail at work? Or in this study task for your work integrated learning unit, what have you done really well? And so that G's them up. Okay, here's where my progress is up to. Right, that's where my progress is up to. Oh, that's right. Here's what I was struggling with doing next. And so just helps you to, by focusing on where the energy is and chasing the energy in that conversation, it feels a lot lighter when you're going through, like some coaching conversations, you feel like it's just like you're wading through a knee-deep muddy slag. And like they can be really quite uncomfortable. But if you chase where the energy is, you chase where the conversation is and the opening and the actual talking, because it's where the talking happens in coaching conversations that the learning is also happening. That's where you have the opportunity to ask a few targeted questions to get them to talk, because as they talk, they start to reflect more. And that's really the point that we're trying to go for. So if we took a textbook approach to this model, we'd say that we start with frame. For example, you walk in and you say, what do we want to talk about today? And if we move, probably it's easier for me to move to the next slide. So within frame, and these are classic questions, and you could even turn up to a coaching conversation with this page, and I'd actually highly recommend it for the first few, and start with, well, what do you want to talk about today? What have you been facing? Where can we go? And as they start to talk about it, when it says what is important about this right now, feel free to ask why it's important. Like you don't always have to stick to the exact format. This is not an exact script. But if you can't get energy out of it, or you can't seem to, especially early on where you don't really know where these teams are up to, going to that E in the middle where they've got those suggested questions, like what would you like to talk about in this conversation today? If they're a bit lackluster, drive it back to the E question. So, well, what's actually exciting about this? What's moving forward at a fast pace? Where are some of the pressing deadlines here? So you actually drive the energy into that conversation with a few of those targeted bolt-on questions. As you move through framing, okay, here's now what we know the scope of today's discussion is going to be. You move on to inquire. Let's take a bit of a deep dive here. Let's move across Gershel and Grattan's. Let's move into a bit more intimate exchange about the nature of the problem, their understanding of it, their feelings. And that allows you then to say, well, let's start putting a box around it, we're starting to move a bit more into disciplined debate. We understand what's going on here. Now I want you to reflect on what's going on here. How does this make sense for you? How could you be engaging with this in a different way? In a perfect world, like if you're running into barriers here, what would a perfect world look like to make all these barriers go away? Those sorts of targeted questions to help them understand that, oh, maybe some of the perfect world is actually here and maybe it's in my own brain as to why the blockages are, or maybe there are genuine structural blockages and you can help them navigate those structural blockages. They're just questions that help you to unpack context in what's going on in their world at the time. As you move through to experiment and to execute, it's really about trying to develop some sort of action plan and taking it forward. So if there's anything that we know from a good meeting, not only do we get through all of the agenda items, we know what we've got to do next. We all walk out of the room a little bit energized going, all right, now here's the 3 things that I've got to get done before the next meeting or before the next project update, before tomorrow's stand-up if you're in a Scrum sort of environment. So this idea that you can actually work towards an action plan, and that gives you an accountability structure. So the next time, like the following week when you have your next coaching conversation, you can start with the framing. How did you go with that execution style? Great. Does that actually then set the framing for it, or is that now completely off the plate and we can move on to the next agenda item? So in terms of playing with this model, in a perfect world, we could spend the next 2.5 hours practicing some coaching with one another. But all I simply want you to do is take this model home with you. For those who have zoomed in, send me the email. I will get you this framework to you, and just have some practice with someone that's in your workplace, for example, or just one of your loved ones. Help. It's a great framework for helping people out. We're even in the grad school, we even said, like, how easy is this for someone new to pick up? We turned this into a card game. For those who are completely unfamiliar with the model, we literally took the questions that we had here, put them onto a set of flip cards, and then dealt them out around the table and said, all right, we're going to start with framing. Let's just pick up a question, any of the questions, and we'll read it and see what happens. And we found that loosely, we could have a reasonable coaching conversation just with those cards and not deviating from the cards. So if you're really, like, if this is a first round for you, or you really want to try this model out just to see what it looks like, that might be one approach. But if you've got the printout and simply the printout of the current slide that's up on screen, I think that's probably enough to give you some pointers as to what could we be asking here, so you can move through that conversation framework. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. The other slides that I have on the slide deck really are just those slides to unpack them a little bit deeper. So you've got the same questions that are on that one page, just a bit easier to read if you need some larger font. But that's really the introduction to coaching, what it's all about, the mindset that sits behind it, and why we really try and focus on good quality conversations. And that quite often we can reflect on what's going on in our own practice with the conversations that we have in the workplace to set us up for how we might be able to improve outcomes on the other side. So noting that we've got some people starting to line up outside for if the room is needed in about 7 minutes. We've got 7 minutes clear for questions. So if anyone's got any questions, please throw them up on the Zoom chat, and I'll get to responding to those. But also in the room, are there any questions that you've got for me at this stage before we call it a close?
As you kind of go through this, I've seen some bad behaviours in the workplace actually working through this. So it's actually a good tool as well to take it back to work. Work on that as well, I guess.
Yeah, so good. It's a portal tool.
Makes it easier to spot. Because
I find a lot of people actually take their mobile and some of them check their emails as well during a meeting, which actually you send it straight away. Also, of a manager, you go to a meeting in the office and the phone goes, and then just pick up the phone and start a conversation. Everyone sits there. Yeah. And it's got a really strong impact on the culture of workplaces, And people feel less valued and they don't bring up issues anymore. Right? They just keep it to themselves.
I think if there's any worthwhile YouTube and chill type things to do, any of the Simon Sinek videos from about 2014 onwards are quite powerful, because he starts to critique, like, what is the role, like, what is the impact of mobile phones on productivity, cognition, and talking about the actual the long-term impacts of multitasking with digital devices on our ability to sense make and remember our sense making process.
It's actually funny because I saw one of his videos and I thought, I'm doing some of this stuff myself.
Yeah, sometimes it's good to be reflective.
Change your behaviour as well. So often in meetings, give you good pockets to put over the table. I think it's a big issue actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. You made me sort of think about it.
Yeah.
Is there like some sort of similar, I guess, where you have to frame all the questions of behaviors, what not to do? Because I kind of find, this is just my personality type. I feel that a lot of people know all the good behaviors, but we often forget. But if you tell this is really poor, not to do, people always remember not to do that. So is there like a...
So do you mean like a coaching do's and don'ts?
Yeah, but like a really good, this is a good do's.
Yep.
Do we have don'ts?
I don't currently, but that's certainly a resource I can put together and share out with the group. Because I mean, at the moment, we're actually developing a coaching training pack, and this is sort of our first run with materials. So by all means, you know, we if there's any desire, like if there's a wish list, I'm happy to meet the wish list.
That would be helpful for me at least, because I think reflecting back on what certain people do, because I mean, I find it a little bit harsh sometimes when I walk into some of the senior leaders' offices and they'll be like, yeah, I'm listening. And then you're like, oh, well, I'll just sit and wait. No, I'm listening. Keep talking.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just seeing a question that's come up. So this is my first time coaching with QT. So can I get some clarification around how I am assigned my team of coachees? Will they just shoot me an email when they need some coaching? Petra, if this is with, I'm not sure about the other unit, but if this is with respect to the business capstone unit, in this particular case, I would be the one introducing you to your team via email to start, but also we'll be setting up a meet and greet for anyone who potentially can before business hours, so about 8:30 in the morning on a Monday morning in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. But that's just something that's it's been evolving at the moment, and we're sort of liaising with Andrew Dick from Deloitte around scheduling for that. So if it's with the capstone unit, I'll absolutely be linking you in. But if it's with the other unit, I think I'll have to get Ingrid to get back to you on that one for that, Petra. Great, you'll have a chat with Andrew. Perfect, cheers, thanks. Okay, any other final questions for today? Otherwise, I'm happy to answer some more questions outside before we go out, or if anyone else online has any questions, just send me an email and I will be absolutely glad to respond.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
No worries. Well, thanks very much for your time, for coming along. Hope you enjoyed the lunch, and thanks for everyone else who logged on online. Thank you.